All right, guys, welcome to Unit 3, Chapter 8 is our first chapter in this unit. Let's go ahead and get this done. It's a shorter one, and this particular unit, this chapter is almost like an introduction to this unit in that it kind of covers a huge time span for a unit, 815 to 1850. It's covering a lot that's going on as far as our economy during this time period. The next couple of chapters, 3 chapters, will actually get into more details about people, politicians, specific events. So this kind of broad overview of this unit. It's easier to think of it like that as we continue on. This is an exciting first half of the century. We're going to see America rise after the War of 1812. Whole bunch more roads are going to be, as far as transportation goes, roads are going to be built, bridges, canals, everything's going to change. And just from this alone, we have, you see 1821, we have 4,000 miles of turnpikes, essentially roads. You can actually see from this picture, we're outside of Houston. This is kind of like an early version of the Sam Houston Tollway, if you will. It's a toll, right? You have to pay a toll to pass through. So those have been around for a couple of hundred years. But nonetheless, we do have 1,000 miles more roads. We have water transportation takes off in a couple of different directions. In 1807, we have our first steamboats. By 1836, we have 361. Steamboats play a huge role. We often think steamboats when we think of the South, Louisiana, Mississippi River. They were essential for transportation within the United States. You could never take a steamboat out to sea or the ocean. That'd be foolish. It has shallow hull, so you could get on the rivers and you could get around quite well. You see, it expands greatly, and it opens up the continent itself. It allows transportations, not just the Mississippi River, but the other rivers that pour into the Mississippi River, connecting all of America, especially if you have canals built and added in there, which we'll talk about that in a second. It does transform inland, and it could have even a larger role in history. There were some politicians at the time that didn't want to build focus on railroads, which were just starting or in America, or roads in general. They saw America as a future, America's future transportation system as a huge number of canals connecting. If you can imagine, instead of using railroad, we poured tons of money into canals, how different things would have been. Some politicians saw it like that. And rightly so, because when you do look at the Mississippi River, at this point in time, America has just barely gotten the Louisiana Purchase. With everything pouring into the Mississippi River on the map, you would see, hey, if we connect all these rivers and waters, we could connect all of America. That's what they were trying to do with the steamboats. And they accomplished that pretty well. But as far as a country of canals, it didn't work out too good. If you did not know what a canal is, it's essentially a waterway that's man-made. It's cut to connect other waterways or widen waterways. In this case, the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal, I'm going to go forward and come back, was actually right here, connecting Lake Erie, who would have thought, all the way to the Hudson River. Now, there's already a connection. There's already a road there, but everybody knows land transportation back then is very slow. But a waterway that you can travel down freely. There was a waterway there, but it wasn't shallow and deep all the way. It wasn't deep and wide enough all the way through. They had to dig some of it out, most of it, for actual commercial transportation. This is the Erie Canal here. It connects to the Hudson, which can get you down to New York and out to the ocean. This was huge. It connected the Midwest, from the farms of the Midwest, all the way to the people of the East. This is where the huge populations were. Imagine the food that goes out there. There's a transportation, systems, communication systems. And imagine the markets this opened up. If you're selling in New York, you can sell to people way out here. And then once you get to Lake Erie, you can see how that connects everything from the railroads and other canals. Canals that connect all the way down to the Mississippi River. From the roads themselves. Eventually we'll have railroads. I'll show you another map that actually shows how the railroads play a role as well. So just canals and roads and the Great Lakes, you can see how these are all connected. Chicago itself spurred greatly after the Erie Canal was completed. The Erie Canal was an amazing feat. Thomas Jefferson thought, and you can quote, he said it was a little short of madness what they planned to do. You're going to dig 40 feet wide, 4 feet deep, for 363 miles. This is pre steam engines, in America, pre steam engines and industrial machines. This is by hand. It was kind of crazy. But the New York governor said we had the opportunity to create a new era in history, more stupendous, more magnificent, and more beneficial than anything has been achieved by the human race. It was amazing in itself. But in order to do this, the guys did have to drain swamps, clear forests, build stone bridges and aqueducts as well, blast through solid rock. It wasn't easy. And most of the work was actually done by German Irish immigrants, which during the 1800s, we'll talk about immigration in a little bit, spurred. It was huge. Immigration was huge during the time period. It did take 8 years to build, but within 7 more years, it already paid for itself. Okay, the shipment of freight went from $100 over the road to only $5. Now that plays a huge role to shipping costs to make things more affordable, but also open up customers. Because if I'm in New York and I want to sell a product to somebody in, let's say, Toledo or Cleveland, right? But it costs so much money to ship it, I have to charge them a lot more to cover the shipping charges. But now when you reduce it from $100 to $5 for shipment of freight, that's going to reduce the price quite a bit, and it makes things more affordable for those in Cleveland. So as a person selling the product, I'm going to sell more. I open up my customer base. The markets open up, but the people in Cleveland also can afford the same products. So the Erie Canal, just an early example of a massive revolution that takes place for markets, for communication, for transportation. And like I said, it connected the Midwest to the East for the first time. This itself was amazing. The only thing to rival this in the world was actually the Suez Canal. The Panama Canal comes much later at the end of the 1800s, and the Panama Canal is something else entirely different. But this was something that people marveled at, and it replicated this idea that, hey, canals could be the way to connect. And you can see how many canals were actually built at the time. It did. People saw this as the future of America, if you will. Railroads, as you can see, are built. They take a little bit longer, obviously, and there's different ways to do this. If you take a look, you can actually, railroads in 1850, by the time 1850 happens, the red are the roads we have. Between the next 10 years and the 50 and 60, we have the purple added on. So it was slow at first. 1825, you had the first ones in England. 1830, there's only 30 miles of track in the United States. Not much at all. But within the next 20 years, from 1830 to 1850, you're going to have 30,000. And then 50 and 60, you can see the double, more than double to connect the rest. Between canals, railroads, rivers, it was America could connect. America as large as Eastern Europe easily. As large as Western Europe, I'm sorry. It was magnificent to see the connection. Now, what that meant was with railroads, like I said, you open up markets, you do have communication and transportation revolution. The canal was a mini experiment compared to railroads. As great as the Erie Canal was, you still had to have water, right? You still had to connect bodies of water. Not with the railroad. The railroad takes it to a whole new level and changes everything. There are disadvantages to railroads. You do have, of course, corruption. And by this, I mean, who's going to pay for the railroad? Well, how do we get congressmen to pass these bills? Well, you give them money and they pass the bill. You give them stock in this one railroad, and they're going to make sure that railroad gets the bid. If you make sure they own stock in that railroad, they're going to make sure that railroad gets more land, free land. You have a lot of corruption and bribery with railroads. And it makes sense. It's the first corporation in America, really. It's a nationwide corporations. So you do see a lot of corruption beginning as early as with the railroad. Native Americans, of course, as well, as we have Americans at this point in history have pushed Native Americans to the other side of the Mississippi River. And now we're going to go and encounter past that to Louisiana Purchase, which Jefferson makes in his first term in early 1800s. And now with the railroad, we're going to go across the land that they have, and they've been separated for so long, not so long, but they've been separated for long enough, and they've been trying to avoid the Americans in general. Now we're going to go right through their land and to them with the railroad. There are other things we never really talk about that don't make history as much. And for ocean transportation, clipper ships, and you may have seen these in like the little bottles, right? with a whole bunch of sails. They were twice as fast as regular ships before this. They were much smaller. The hull, I don't know if you can tell, much more narrow in order to cut across the water, but they were twice as fast. So if you're trying to get something from New York all the way to San Francisco, back then you had to go all the way down past South America, very dangerous route, all the way back up the coastline. There was no Panama Canal. And if you had a perishable or anything you want to get there quickly, these were twice as fast. Of course, it would be more expensive, right? Because they take a smaller load. But it was an option you did have if you had cargo to ship and get over. We don't talk about it a lot. You probably never heard of clipper ships because they're kind of put out of place with the railroad, which ends up being incredibly faster once the transcontinental road gets built. So the railroads, who's going to finance these? Well, we talked about how the biggest political parties at the time, the ideas that they have is either, is this constitutional or not constitutional? Or it depends on how you view the Constitution. Or you're going to have a very strict interpretation. If you have a very strict interpretation, nobody in the Constitution wrote, hey, the government can build railroads or can pay for railroads. Railroads didn't exist when our founding fathers wrote the Constitution. They wouldn't know that. So the argument is say, hey, you can't have a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Things change over time. Well, if you have a more broad, a loose interpretation, you can say the Constitution does say that Congress's job is to promote the general welfare and to regulate commerce. I would argue railroad connecting and bringing products to people back and forth is the best thing for the general welfare of the people. And commerce is just another word for business. So the government can regulate commerce between states and other foreign powers. That's in the Constitution as well. So if you have that broad interpretation, this easily fits in. Others who have a strict one would argue not so, right? What ends up happening is state governments and federal governments both will do this to buy stock in the railroads. And if you remember, stock in the railroad works just like the joint stock companies. The railroad company has this idea to build its railroad, but in order to do so, they need money. They raise money. They tell people, hey, you buy stock in this company. Once the company is built and the railroad's making money, it becomes profitable, and you'll make money when you sell that stock back to anybody, right? So buying stock, not just private investors like joint stock companies, but now you have the government buying stock into it as well. And this actually has continued even to modern times. The bailouts we had in 2008, the government actually bought a lot of stock in companies, and it actually happens in other countries too. The government bought a lot of stock in the companies, which happens in other countries as well. Land grants, that's a big one too. Land is very expensive, especially when you're connecting all this land. You only need a small portion of it. So the government, especially state governments, did this quite a bit. They gave land to railroad companies so they can build the railroads on their land. Now, this is when you get some debate or problems. Essentially, if the railroad's getting paid 25 cents for every mile of rail that they lay down, they might make curves, they might go a longer route, which means they need more land, which asks the government for more land. And the government would give them more land. But the government also would give them, say, 2 or 3 miles on both sides of the track. Well, who owns that land now? The railroad company? Or the people who own stocks in the railroad company? Which means that they're going to sell that land, and that land's going to be worth a lot of money later on because it's connected to the railroad. That's where the towns pop up, along the railroads, of course. So there is the idea of corruption and how it really is affecting the first corporations in America. The big thing here is the federal government can do this. Tariffs, reduce the iron tariffs. Iron at the time is not really largely made in the U.S. It's actually very difficult to get a hold of. And in order to help promote our own industry and revolution manufacturing, there were tariffs. So that if you try to buy iron from Great Britain, it was cheaper, but now there's a tariff on it, so you had to pay more. Well, in order to get these railroads built, needed iron. So the federal government would lower the tariffs on iron specifically, so railroads companies could afford more iron and get built. It's much similar to what we see now with steel. The current administration, Trump administration, they have tariffs on steel from China, right? They're trying to help the steel industry in America, especially up north where a lot of steel is. Well, here in Baytown, we're supposed to have a plant being built right now. But in order to build that plant, the owners needed affordable steel. Steel in America was too expensive. Steel from China was much cheaper, and they could afford to build these plants. But with that tariff, they couldn't afford to build a plant anymore. And the those behind the power or the plant here that they were trying to build, they went to the administration. They asked for a couple of exceptions, and the administration said no and no. So in this case, the tariff hurt us here in Baytown and stopped from creating a whole bunch of jobs. It's kind of the same thing with them, and that you reduce the iron tariffs, they can lay more track and actually make the railroad. So if we see a reduction in steel tariffs from China now, then when we see more built, and it's better for the people. We're going to talk more about tariffs in a second with Adam Smith and his viewpoint on it. Okay, so not only do we have a market revolution with this, a transportation revolution, obviously with moving with railroads and canals, steamboats, but it is a communication. So I mentioned that before, but you got to think of the way things were previously. 49 days for the treaty that ended War of 1812 to reach the U.S. That's why we had a battle in New Orleans, right? George Washington's death in Virginia took a week for people to find out in New York. So this would eventually be a communications revolution, even though it's people communicating back and forth. The telegraph will pop up in this time period, and you'll notice that they end up alongside railroad tracks. So the farther you go out, like west, you have telegraph installed right next to the tracks, and you'll see that's how it connects people far away. It's actually pretty ingenious idea. American technology during this time period: first sewer systems, machines made by clothing, which means exact sizes, everything exactly the same, made quicker and more efficiently, which means more cheaper. Newspaper magazines become so much more affordable. Literacy will increase as well. And even the sewage systems is key. Here you have them actually building what is going to be a sewage system for disease and your standards of living. Cholera had broken out in London in this time, and they had traced it back to one water source and had spread from there. So that's a really huge deal for the technology of this time. It is a changing point, because when you think about the end of 1700s, we don't talk about technology much, right? We're just talking about us trying to start our government. But in the first half of the 1800s, we really see it take off. 1840s. It's an interesting decade in the world in general, but even in America, we're going to see stuff like Charles Goodyear. If you guys heard of Goodyear tires, he's going to figure out a way to vulcanize rubber. And he actually does it in his kitchen with his own oven. He makes a substance. He makes a substance by accident, and he can't figure out what he's going to do with this when it dries. Eventually, he realizes it's a good source for tires and rubber. Howe is going to design sewing machines. Singer will be the company that buys the design and improves it greatly. And so we have Singer sewing machines you even see today. Your parents might have one. 1832, the first telegraph is sent from Baltimore to D.C. And that's pretty close for 1832. By 1840, they're getting spread all over. And it's nothing more than a system, electronic system put in place where you tap for a little bit of electronic beep to go through. This is a D. A longer one shows a dash. And using that, you make it alphabet, and you're able to communicate. The next level, and that's a telephone, which takes off much later. But you do have first telegraphs in the mid-1800s. Modern marketing takes off once you have these larger and larger corporate or companies, and they have to compete with each other. They also have to reach new customers. The idea of marketing itself takes off. And you can use Sears and Roebuck, now known as Sears. They're one of the early ones in this time period. And they capitalized really with like Transcontinental Railroad. They would put a magazine on the railroad, on the trains. And so when you got there, you would look through, you find something like, ladies, if you saw this dress, you like that dress, you filled out a form on a piece of paper, the item number, the name of the dress, and your size. You put that in an envelope and put your money in there, and you mailed that to Chicago, and then from Chicago, they could send it out to Transcontinental Road all the way out to California eventually at one point. So railroads, even though we don't have Transcontinental Road in 1840 yet, not until after Civil War, it is wonders what the road does in general. We always wait until, it seems like we always talk about after the Transcontinental Road, but all this was already happening prior to it. So it's pretty interesting how marketing, advertising, everything takes off this point. We have that competition. As far as agriculture is concerned, you have a revolution of its own. The cotton gin, which everybody remembers from 8th grade how it increased slavery to huge numbers, and it's true. Used to pick 50 pounds of cotton. A person could pick 50 pounds of cotton all day, or it would take all day to separate 1 pound. So essentially what you had was pick 50 pounds of cotton, and then the same person could separate the seeds. So it was 50 days separating the seeds before they picked another one. It was really inefficient. Cotton just wasn't producing and making a lot of money, as a matter of fact, for them. It actually got to a point where in Virginia and Maryland, they weren't even growing tobacco anymore because tobacco did just grow it too much and suck the nutrients from the soil, that they looked at cotton, couldn't make cotton because it was too cold in Virginia and Maryland. And so they had actually slowly were getting rid of slavery on their own. But once Eli Whitney comes out with the cotton gin, all right, 50 times faster, things are a lot quicker, they can produce a lot more cotton. Those southern colonies farther south, when they're established and have that warm climate, they're going to bring slavery there in huge numbers. And what you have is Maryland, Virginia, less and less need for slaves. People from there will ship them out and sell them to those new southern colonies. And so it's on Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana. Those territories are going to have a massive number of slaves. And you can actually look at the statistics here. 1790, more than half the slaves were in 2 states alone. But by 1860, by the time we have Civil War, those 2 states only have 15%. They actually were slowly doing away with slavery because there was no need for it. When it came to tobacco, it's very labor intensive. You need a lot of labor. When it came to corn and wheat, not so much. So the need for slaves actually were slowly ending in Virginia and Maryland in general. But the South is going to become the staple from it. And cotton is king becomes a famous phrase, especially when industry takes off in the North, in textile industry. They look to the South for those raw supplies. And so the South will focus on it even more as their only and main cash crop. But that could never happen without the cotton gin. It would have just been too intensive and you wouldn't needed that many slaves. But now you need as many slaves as you can picking cotton because it only takes one to separate them. Farming in the West. Now this is the Great Plains, but more so the Ohio River Valley, that area. But we are starting to move into Great Plains past the Mississippi River. That's a Louisiana Purchase. During the first decade, we're going to see guys like John Deere. You probably heard of him. They're going to make a name for themselves and become pretty famous, as you guys know, in McCormick as well. There's 2 examples. What happens is in the East, like I said, the soil is being sucked of all its nutrients. You've planted the same crop again and again and again. You have to switch crops. It's not growing. Soil in general in the East was pretty bad at this point. You think it's been 200 years since Jamestown. That's how often people have been growing the same crop as much as they can. So people were looking to move west, and that becomes more of a staple. You can get some inventions that really help out. 1819, we have the iron plow with interchangeable parts, meaning that if something breaks on it, you just can go buy another part and fix it. That's it. You just replace that one part. That sounds like common sense, and we have that now with cars and every other anything other mechanical. You that one part breaks, you can go buy that one part to fix it. But there was a point where if something broke, you had to take it to a blacksmith or somebody, and they had to fix the whole thing or buy a whole new one. But with replaceable parts, that changed. John Deere takes that replaceable plow and instead of iron, he uses steel. If you're wondering the difference, iron is more natural. It's how it's dug up out of the ground. But if I had a big piece of iron, I could actually bend it. If I set on it hard enough, I could actually bend it. But steel is iron from the ground, burnt really hot. The impurities are taken out of it. Pretty much the carbon is burnt out of it. And then when it's dried, it's stronger, and it's called steel. Now, in the early 1800s, this was a long process, very difficult, and you could do small amounts at a time, not enough to make a plow. Right? John Deere comes up with a steel plow with interchangeable parts in 1937. The rest is history, as you know now. 1831, you might have heard of McCormick, like McCormick seasoning. Before McCormick seasoning, actually, this is how the man becomes wealthy. Cyrus Hall McCormick comes up with his mechanical reaper. You see it down here on the right. Essentially, what we have as the horses pull the carriage, the wheels turn, and the wheels will turn a crank attached to pulleys belts, levers, and stuff like that. And it actually will cause this to turn and collect hay, cut and collect hay, stack it up. Now things have become more modernized, right? So they're more efficient. These just closed. You see them when building the hay, it's closed and it's ties and everything for you. But this is the beginnings of the mechanical reaper. There's nothing electric about it. The wheels are moving, cranks are moving. It's all mechanical. But it's enough where he quits farming, starts a plant in Chicago. A lot of people just start. I use Chicago as an example before because Chicago is so central United States, and once you get the railroad connecting Chicago, it pretty much allows access to customers all over. So McCormick comes with the mechanical reaper, and if you're wondering, that was 2 people could work this and get 12 acres of wheat or hay per day. Compared to the old way, we have what's called a sickle, and the sickle, you would take a bushel of wheat, so it's round, and you hack at it. That's why it was round, so you could hack at it pretty well. That took half an acre a day. Or you could do a half an acre a day here compared to 12 acres with 2 people in mechanical reaper. That takes off tremendously. You probably heard a reaper before. Let me exit out of this and show you guys. When we talk about, it's a perfect time to talk about this. When we talk about reaper, the Grim Reaper is probably something you guys have heard of before, right? It's Halloween, right? And if you're wondering why he's got that instead of a sickle, this is a form of it. It's a kind where you stand up and you swipe while standing, and you can cut the hay and wheat or whatever you're cutting, but you cut it down, just like the Grim Reaper will cut you down, right? As you grow, eventually he comes and takes you down. This is why he's called the Grim Reaper. He's reaping you, and that's the tool he uses to do it. Now, you also may have seen the sickle used before here. There you go. Oh, sorry, not. I don't know why it did that. The Soviet Union flag and the symbol of the Soviet Union was a sickle and a hammer to represent the farmers, and the industrial workers was a hammer. So you probably have seen that before if you haven't seen it with the Reaper himself. But that's where it comes from. So Halloween's the first time to talk about that and the mechanical reaper that, come on, there it goes. The reaper that we talk about today. So just think it's always perfect timing for that. All right, so this is what the population looks like, right? So this is 1820. Okay, so we talked about War of 1812. We moved past that. That was the last unit, right? And we're coming up into the 1800s. This is a new America, and this is a perfect example of that. If you look, the purple here is going to be the more densely populated areas, meaning there's over 90 people per square mile. The more people in square mile, the more populated it is, right? Like a city. You go out here to these light brown ones, there's less people per square mile. There's less than 2 people per square mile. That's less populated. That's the countryside. That's like one person owning a lot of land, right? So that's 1820. But if you take a look from 1820 to 1860, 40 years later, magnificent growth. This is huge. When the Civil War breaks down in 1860, this is what we're looking at. We see in Michigan, Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, St. Louis too, has longer waterways. But all those places that are connected through the transportation system, whether it be railroads or canals, you're going to see a huge growth there. And it's pretty interesting how that appears. But that is a big difference. 40 years, we see it changing America, right? Agriculture and national economy, the Industrial Revolution. That's the difference we see. All right, so this Industrial Revolution itself, the early textile manufacturing, we talked about that before, how this all starts. It really starts with the embargo of 1807. I talked about that, how once we put embargo on Britain and France, especially Britain, we've got to start making our own. And that's how people really start in the United States. By 1815, it's taken off. There's hundreds of different mills in the United States producing textiles. This is a first industrial lobbying. So lobbying is simply defined as you going to congressmen and trying to get a law or acts passed of some sort. Now, we typically think of lobbying as being a bad thing because we talk about how pharmaceutical companies will pay for campaigns. And back then, they bribe the congressman. Railroads had lobbyists. They would go and bribe the congressman, hey, make sure that you take our railroad to do this. Make sure you give our railroad enough land. So lobbying has always existed, but it's also a good thing. People often forget that what Martin Luther King did with civil rights was he lobbied to congressmen. We lobby to congressmen all the time. Lobbying can be a good and it can be a bad thing. It gets a bad rap, but it also gets good laws passed too. Right. So the first industrial lobbying on part in the United States was the textile industry, and they would lobby for tariffs on British textiles. So if a British textile costs $4 a roll, but an American costs $4 a roll, you had to pick between which one to buy. And most people bought the best material, cheapest price. But if the textile industry lobbies to Congress and says, hey, pass a tariff, okay, a 25% tariff on all British textiles. Well, now that same textile is $5 a roll instead of $4. It went up 25%. So you buy the $4 or the $5 one. We're going to buy the $4 one. And that's made in America, and you're helping the American industries. That's what lobbyists wanted to do. Now up in New England, they hated tariffs because the less shipping that's done, the less that comes in the port, the less money they make. So they oppose tariffs greatly. But if you were in the industry itself, you really wanted tariffs. Customers always pay the price of tariffs. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations wrote, in 1776, he wrote this, and it's really starting to spread at this point in time. When it comes to tariffs, people suffer. The consumer does, because you're ended up paying more for something that could have been cheaper, right? It ends up hurting the consumer more than anybody else. In The Wealth of Nations, he'll also talk about the visible hand, how the government should in general stay out of as much economic matters as possible and allow the market to decide everything. Now, that's something that's going massive debate for all of U.S.'s history, from the Great Depression when the government wouldn't do anything to the 1920s before the Great Depression when the government refused to regulate business, and it got so bad that people were lying about the stock market and other things. Even to modern times now, where companies or banks can make really bad loans. Well, if the government doesn't regulate them, they should be able to do whatever they want. And some of us think that the banks should make really bad loans, because then that's going to collapse and come down on all of us. So as we saw in 2008. So it's a massive debate even now. Should the government stay out of it? It's called the invisible hand of the economy, or should the government be involved? There's good sides to both. There's good arguments to both sides, and I think America does really well as finding a middle ground. And that's why we've been so successful as a capitalist economy. The Lowell system is a good example of the mill system in general that we have in America. They took this concept of everything happening under one roof. The cotton is spun, then it's made into fabric. All that's done under one roof. But these guys in New England who made this, the Lowell system, they also they didn't want to produce like an underclass, poor group of individuals like they had in England. They wanted people to have jobs for a few years. And so they recruited young adult women for this primarily, who would come, and they actually had a bell schedule you see here on the side, where they have reading time, they'll eat, they'll work, they'll learn, and they were paid as well. And they usually sent that money back home because they need the money because they stayed there. It was almost like a dorm room or dorm life in college for a few years. And then you would go off, get married, and have a family of your own, right? The guys who made this, that's what the teaching was. Instead of creating a whole underclass or underprivileged class system, was to have people come in for a few years and women come in for a few years, learn some of this, leave when they were ready to start their family, and have extra money sent back home. And best of all, everything's done under one roof. Cotton's brought in, spun, turned into string, turned into yarn, then it's turned to fabric and woven. Everything's done under one roof. It was so well that hundreds copied the system, and some of them did try with the women as well. The problem with the Lowell system is just as anything that happens, when new owners eventually buy them out, their main goal is to make a profit, not increase the education of these young women, and they would slowly cut out class time, reading time. And the women would actually strike and get some of that back, but eventually it just became a system to make as much fabric as possible, as cheaply as possible, and so the owners can increase their profits. Essentially, the bad side of capitalism. But the original owners had a great idea of having women work in the system. One thing I always forget to talk about, or often forget, and we often all forget, is what this does to the environment. The Lowell system, this first industry textiles that we have in America that does everything, they're not run by steam power yet. They're actually run by water power. So they place new rivers, or rivers are diverged a little bit to make canals, or they're built up like this, where they're going to pour out the other side like a waterfall. And that creates enough power to turn a wheel. That, in a sense, will turn a whole mechanism of cranks and pulleys and several different machines to sew and make other things. You had to be near a river for these first factories. But oftentimes you altered that river, either the current or how much water is flowing through, or you dug a whole canal out to the side of it. You altered the environment with that. It doesn't talk about that much. When we talk about environmental history, it is worth mentioning. And with all these factories near waterways and transportation ways, you're going to see an increase in the cities. Industrialization is just that. Cities are growing with industry as industry grows. You can see from these numbers, we're going to have cities in 1860 with over 100,000 people, like New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago, Cincinnati. Other ones have over 150,000. Then you see all those on there as well. Most of these are along waterways, not just because of trading, but now because they're cities producing with factories. Okay, and if you're living in the countryside and you don't have much money, you don't have land of your own, the city was a area where you could become wealthy. You could get a job. If you wanted innovation, people weren't inventing things in the countryside, right? People were doing that in the city. So this is a big attraction for those in the countryside to move to cities to try to find work, and that even goes on in today. The urban population in this time period went from 3% to 16%. So many people were moving to cities in huge numbers. Now, just like people move from the country to the city to find work, people do that from country to country, like nation to nation, not just rural to urban. We're going to get into that in just a second. As people begin to work in the city, they have more leisure time. I know what you're thinking, how do you have more leisure time? When we work on a farm, sun up to sundown, you're working outside. It's pretty late, and even at nighttime, you're performing some work that you can do inside by candlelight, and then you go to bed, wake up, repeat. We talk about how the life of a woman, how it was like 5 in the morning to 10 at night, sleep, repeat, sleep, repeat. But with the urban areas, and you're paid for your work, you didn't have to go cut down trees for firewood. Like literally, that's what they spent all their extra time doing in the summertime, was cutting trees for the winter, to get through the winter. Not in the city, you just go buy coal or buy firewood. You in the countryside, you had to skin animals, hunt for animals, raise your animals. It's a lot quicker just to go buy your food, which is what people did in the city. Okay, so that more time meant that people did more things, and recreation in the city takes off. Urban recreation. You have a lot of drunks. There's also a time period where domestic violence takes off. Guys spend more time in bars than ever before. There's dog fighting, cockfighting, that takes off in this time period. And the big one is prize fighting, boxing, right? That starts during this time period in the early 1800s. People fighting for a prize. And then you have performing arts in the theater, comedy, Shakespeare dramas, and the infamous blackface minstrel. So when we see people and celebrities do this, they don't do it often. Politicians have done this too, if you pay attention up north. They do this, or they paint their entire faces black. The white people do this, and they pretend to be black. This word blackface comes from these theater shows that used to happen regularly in the north, especially, and in the south. African Americans weren't allowed to be actors, so we had guys like down here on the right. This man is painting his entire face black and hands so he could be this actor in the plays. Now, these minstrels, these plays, essentially were very unrealistic. They typically showed myths, and the biggest one was that slaves were stupid, goofy. That's why you always see it portrayed like this, like some goofy guy that couldn't survive on his own, and his master took care of him like a fatherly figure. And these slaves were very happy in their role, having a fatherly figure to take care of them. Very stereotypical, very much myths, not realistic at all, as we know the history of slavery. By far not accurate. But that's what they showed in the North. Right? None of these actually used real African American melodies. They created their own. It was pretty embarrassing looking back to say that, hey, this was this concept of this is how they actually thought African American lives, and it actually just spread the myth even more. People in the North for the longest time didn't think slavery was that bad, not until right up to the Civil War, with stuff like Uncle Tom's Cabin being written. Now, I mentioned how people go from the rural areas to the urban areas in huge numbers. And I said the same thing happens when people go from nation to nation or country to country. Europe during the 1840s was hectic. There's revolutions taken apart all over. And in Ireland, there's a famine, a potato famine, that all comes back to Ireland years after Columbus starts the Columbian Exchange, bringing potatoes back to Europe. Now Ireland faces a potato famine. In Europe, there's revolutions all over. Great Britain, not so much, and not so much Russia, but everywhere else, including France, there's a lot of changes taking place. Even in the Western Hemisphere, there's also revolutions taking place. This is turmoil in Europe. And between 1845 and 1854, we have the largest immigration movement in U.S. history, 2.4 million. 14.5% of all people were actually immigrants. And by 1860, by the break of the Civil War, 1 in every 8 Americans were actually foreign born, not born in America. So for every 8 you can count, they're foreign born. There's 3 main groups we're going to talk about: the Irish, Germans, and everybody else. We just throw in a group on their own, almost everybody else. The Irish came over obviously because of potato famine. 1 million deaths. People flocked. They fled Ireland to find food and work. Remember, potatoes were not native to Ireland. It's brought over after the Columbian Exchange. And then all of a sudden you have a crop there, and it's easy to grow plenty of it. You have a larger family. People did that. Then a famine happens where potatoes are mysteriously dying out. All of a sudden you have that huge population with no food to support it. So over 1 million deaths, and people fled Ireland to find food and work elsewhere, and naturally it came to America. By 1850, 43% of the immigrants in America were Irish. They don't like freed blacks. Not because they're racist, but because that's non-skilled competition. So when we look at manual labor, the Irish, most of them couldn't read or write. They were there for labor. Free blacks, that's all they were capable or allowed to do. It's both concepts of free labor competing with each other. There were sayings like, "My master is a great tyrant. He treats me badly as if it was a common Irishman." The Irish will face the first discrimination we see from as far as immigrants concerned. These are actual, that's an actual article here saying no Irish need apply to take care of these children. Help wanted, no Irish need apply. There's even been, I think, Guinness beer commercial that showed how it used to be, about how the Irish were once the target of discrimination, and they had to deal with that. But the Irish will have a hero. 1829, early 1830s, Andrew Jackson is president for 2 terms, and he's a Scots-Irish. He's Scots-Irish descent. He's a common man. As far as that's concerned. So he was a hero to many of the Irish all over America. By 1860, by the outbreak of the Civil War, Catholics are the largest Christian denomination in America. More than Baptists, more than Methodists, more than anybody else, Catholics reign in America. And when we think about it, we've only had 1 Catholic president, because people were really scared of Catholics for the longest time. They had to fight a stereotype, which we're going to come back to in a second. Okay, and I say we've had 1 Catholic president, that's JFK. But we may have another one in less than a month, right? Biden's running for president, and he's Catholic. He'd be the 2nd Catholic president. Germans were another big group, very large. They're a little bit different. Revolutions in Germany weren't widespread. There was no famine. People that usually came over were middle class-ish, and that they could read or write. And they weren't dirt poor. They weren't Catholic. Third were Catholic. Roughly 250,000 were Jewish, but most were Protestants. And they did have enough money where if they didn't didn't make it here in groups, 14% actually went home. So they weren't as bad off as the Irish coming over, starving essentially. But the most famous probably German immigrant we have is Levi Strauss from the Levi Strauss Company. Exists even today. He starts his jean company here in America during the Industrial Revolution. Now, the British, Scandinavian, Chinese, they're our next, third largest group put together. The British continue as normal. 1843, we have a jump in Scandinavians. You'll see a huge, large number of them within a 20-year period move over here in huge numbers. But the big one we talk about is the Chinese. And mainly it's California, and it makes sense. Europeans came through New York. Chinese people came across the Pacific Ocean because China was on the coast of the Pacific Ocean. The part of the United States that's closest is California. And of course, this is by 1860s and right after the Civil War, 1865. We had 35,000 by 1860. And just like the Irish in the East that did all the manual labor and were treated horribly, that's the Chinese in the West, in California. And when you know about it, because you've seen pictures of the Transcontinental Railroad, and you know the Chinese worked on it, you know they did everything that they possibly could for very little pay. And we talk about that quite a bit, how Chinese workers were subjugated to that. And they would be this other next immigrant group that's faces discrimination, including an entire act passed banning them, excluding them from America. Now, here's the term I want you to know. I will ask you one, if not several questions about nativism on the test. You've heard this word recently. It has come back into play in the past 4 years. But natives were a group of people that they may have been born in the United States, but their parents weren't or their grandparents weren't. Obviously, the only natives, true natives in America were Native Americans. But after a couple of generations, people called themselves natives and didn't like these new people coming over, especially the Irish. This could be seen in the movie Gangs in New York, which you guys are more than welcome to do a movie review over. That deals with a lot of nativism. They even use the terms nativism. So nativism isn't necessarily racism, but you're anti-immigrant. Even if you were immigrant, even if your family was an immigrant, even if your father or grandfather was an immigrant, you hate these new people coming over. In this case, it's specifically the Irish. All right, 1834, a mob will actually take off and burn a Catholic convent. So that just shows how bad it was against Catholic Irish peoples. 1844, there's armed clashes in Philadelphia outside the Opera House. This gets burned down. There's a huge fight between Irish immigrants. Nativists will get together and they form a political party of their own. It's called the American Party. It's often nicknamed a know-nothing party. Because when you ask them what they stood for, they would say, we don't know anything. But we know we're never going to vote for a foreigner or a Catholic for president. They never become a serious threat as president or anything like that. But they are. They do have senators and members in the House of Reps. The American Party does get into that. And down here on this link, I have this modern day version of nativism. And it's a professional wrestling clip where these guys do this interview and they're talking bad about Hispanics coming over. So when we look at nativism and we talk about how history repeats itself, it really often does, especially in the case of nativism. It repeats itself so much that this actually, in the second semester, we talk about nativism again. And that's actually where the STAR test picks up and talks about nativism. The big problem people had with Catholics as president then was that there was the idea that if you're Catholic, you did whatever the Pope said and the Pope controlled you. Meaning that if a Catholic became president, then essentially the United States would be controlled by the Pope. JFK broke that stereotype. He addressed that early on, and people became okay with it, with JFK being Catholic. And even now, there's still some push against it. Many people do this. Many Catholics will say other Christians aren't Christians, and many Christians say Catholics aren't Christians. What they mean is that they're not following the correct denomination, so not true Christians. But nonetheless, they're all Christians because they all have the same Savior, that being Jesus Christ. Okay. So nativism is a big part. I'll ask that question several times. The rise of professions during this time period, we actually people having jobs, not just farming, right? Industrial Revolution, you've got cities, you got people that work in the cities, not just factory workers. Teaching takes off. It's poor pay, not like now where we make millions, right? But it actually was only done, mainly done by 17, 18-year-old man, first time looking for work. And often they would move on to law. Lincoln did this. A lot of guys would teach for 2 years and then move over to practicing law. In 1820, 11 and 23 states had no requirements to practice law. You just opened up a law firm, did your best to get a couple of court cases, get out the word of mouth, and then you would try to win. So you're self-taught of law, and medicine was pretty much the same way. Sometimes you learn from assisting, but sometimes you read and you're self-taught. And without regulations, without school requirements or degrees requirements or even state tests or anything like that, you got some pretty horrible people. You can even see without regulations what happens with the products for your health. Asthma cigarettes, for temporary relief of asthma, effectively treats asthma, hay fever, foul breath, all diseases of the throat, head colds, canker sores, bronchitis pretty much. All that could be fixed with this Dr. Batty's asthma cigarettes. That's what happens when you don't have rules telling companies they can't lie on their product labels, but not recommended for children under 6. you give them candy cigarettes now. Cocaine toothache drops, right? Cocaine would fix that pain, I'm sure, but cocaine fixes all pain, right? But this is exactly why regulation eventually does settle into America, and Americans are okay with it. Because with all this, you can imagine the type of people that are practicing medicine that didn't know what they were doing, the people that are practicing law that didn't know what they were doing, but they were tricking people that they knew what they were doing. And even the products that had this stuff, you can see how over time, the idea of the government does need to have some hand in the economy and regulate. You can see how that really eventually comes to being. All right. Last and most important profession is engineering. Now, we know this here. A lot of people in Baytown always talk about chemical engineering, sometimes electrical, sometimes mechanical. This was mechanical engineering primarily. Early 1800s, this was so important for everything from building the bridges for the railroads. Someone had to engineer and design those to make sure they could last long and also support the weight of railroad trains. Canals had to be engineered. When you did get to steam engines, or even the cranks turning the mills with waterways or steam boats, somebody had to design those, and you have to design them, and somebody's got to make them more efficient, the best that they can. Those were engineers. That's what their job was. Roads and bridges as well. Even here we have even products in general. And the Civil War is the largest profession by the time the Civil War breaks out, and it's needed greatly in the Civil War to build those makeshift bridges to attack, to get over into forts. Cannons. People don't realize how important cannons are. Probably in physics, you guys learned the angles and velocity. Cannons were important in the Civil War because they had different types of cannons. They have cannonballs that exploded over your head. So your aim was to make sure you got it over a high populated area right above the head, and it would explode in a whole bunch of pieces. Some were exploding in one central area. Some cannons had a spiral carved inside them that made them more accurate, more deadly. So even in the Civil War, as far as weapon making and interchangeable parts, engineering played a key and important role. So that is like the biggest and most important profession of this time in the early 1800s. Okay. Now, as far as equal opportunities go, this is really see Americans develop that idea that equal opportunity should be available for everybody. Okay, that was a very egalitarian idea. And the concept behind this was that you're not guaranteed everything the same, right? You're not guaranteed this, you're not guaranteed that. You're guaranteed the opportunity. And that's a big difference. Now, when white male immigrants came over, there was everything for those ideas and excited them. So, and when they got that idea, when they were able to achieve that American dream, it should make plenty of sense that over time, other groups, not just white male immigrants, but African-American groups and women, they would see that and want to know why don't they have those equal opportunities to rise with the American dream as well. So this is this chapter in closing. This first chapter, Unit 3. And again, this is just a brief summary of 1800 to roughly 1860 when the Civil War breaks out. Our next 3 chapters goes in detail with specific politicians, events, and people in general. And that concludes this.